Welcome back to our lecture on North America for World Regional Geography. In this lecture, we're going to focus on history and culture, mostly on history of the United States. There will be a little bit of references to Canada, but most of the United States. The history of the United States, as we know, begins with the establishment of the 13 colonies, which lasts from 1625 to 1775. And these colonies were located in the eastern seaboard of the United States and the Atlantic coast. These colonies in different parts of the eastern section had been established through royal charters, which were basically permission by the British Crown to go to these other areas, claim them for Britain, and then as part of claiming them for Britain, you pay taxes to Britain, but you get to exploit them economically. Okay, some of the first companies were the Plymouth Company, for example, which settled in Massachusetts, in the Northeast. We also have the London Company, which settled plantations in the South, and most of the people at this time traced their ancestry to Britain. Of course, we already have indigenous populations here that are going to be interacting most often in a conflicting way with the new settlers that are coming to take their land, basically, and to settle it and exploit the land to begin trading with the British Empire and other countries. The Virginia colony, for example, was established to grow tobacco, and in order to grow tobacco, they also imported enslaved people from Africa or the Caribbean. After 1619, Africans that were forcibly settled as slaves in the colonies began to carry out most of the labor to produce cotton, sugar, or tobacco, or to cut wood to produce ships, to use them for trade. The American Revolution of 1776 is very important. We basically have an upper class and the population that are tired of paying taxes to the crown. This is the revolt, for example, against the Stamp Act, the Boston Tea Party, right? It's a revolt against the taxation of tea, which back then is the most common drink that people have. And so this basically is an economic rebellion against the crown, but it also has political significance because of the introduction of economic and social liberalism and democracy. The United States begins to create a new type of country, a republic, in which the citizens can vote, for example. Of course, at this point in U.S. history, only people with property can vote, but later on, democracy is going to be expanded to include more people. There are, however, some contradictions in the new country where the economy relies in large part on slavery, but also conquering indigenous lands and expanding west. The 13 colonies that were part of Great Britain coexist within a broader settlement and colonization by the French Empire, but also the Spanish Empire. And the French Empire is going to leave its cultural, political mark on Canada, especially in the region of Quebec, where today the city of Montreal and Quebec City are two of the largest French-speaking cities in the world. Montreal is one of the largest French-speaking cities in the world after Paris, for example. And in the Southwest and in Florida, we're going to see the influence of Spain. Definitely the California missions are part of that history. What this is going to mean for Native Americans, however, is further encroachments on their lands, especially after 1812, when the United States begins a series of wars in the Ohio Valley, for example, to claim more land. And throughout the 19th century, the United States is going to be driven by what we know as manifest destiny, which is the ideological conviction of many people that God willed the United States to expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and that the process of colonization was in part a civilizing mission to introduce Christianity, but also to produce in the land a land that was given to Americans to a certain extent by God, right? So these are some of the religious justifications that are used. What this is going to mean for indigenous people, however, is that these nations and tribes that existed are going to lose their land, and today they only hold jurisdiction and control over indigenous reservations, for example. U.S. expansion west is also going to come with the annexation of Texas, which is basically Anglo settlers that were invited by Mexico to settle Texas. They then begin to rebel, and they declared the Republic of Texas, so that the United States then comes and helps them, and eventually Texas is annexed, right? But this is the beginning of what is going to be the American invasion of Mexico, in which Mexico and the U.S. are going to go to war, and Mexico is going to lose large sections of northern Mexico, but what is going to be California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, etc. After 1848, we're going to see an important rush of migration to the West Coast, because from 1848 to 49, we see the California gold rush. And that is really going to begin to settle these new territories that the United States have taken from Mexico are going to be settled by this gold rush and this silver and gold mining and copper rush as well, right? And later on in Arizona and other places, there's also a silver rush and a copper rush. Of course, throughout this whole period, we should remember, right, that there was some resistance to Black and Asian migration. For example, in Oregon, up until the 20th century, many cities and counties did not allow Black people to settle and move there, or Asian people were discriminated against, especially Chinese immigrants were discriminated against through the Chinese Exclusion Act. Another important infrastructure was the Transcontinental Railroad, which is going to bring, right, many of these immigrants from the east to the western United States, and it's going to it's going to connect the United States to the Pacific Ocean as well, and to other countries like Australia, Japan, China. The United States, by the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, is a rising empire. And we see the rise of imperialism globally. Imperialism is a system in which we still live today, right? Where the strongest capitalist countries, they have economic and political domination over the weaker countries. We no longer need to necessarily occupy a place with colonization to control it, but rather through economic or military means, the countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, the British, right, the British Empire, or the French Empire in this period were the ones that were the empires controlling colonies and other sections of the world. For the United States and Britain, what this means is this notion that because the United States and the British Empire are more advanced, it is the white man's burden that this idea that, you know, in exchange for taking over these lands and making them productive, they also have to bring civilization, and they have to bring knowledge to these savages, to these people, right? So this is a very racist idea, but it's supposed to justify taking over these areas. And for the United States, it means the annexation through gunboat diplomacy of the Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and Hawaii, which had been colonies, some of them under Spain, but had fought for their independence, believing that the United States was helping them become independent, but later on the United States occupies and colonizes Cuba and Puerto Rico and Guam, for example, and for a period the Philippines as well. With part of the rise of imperialism economically and militarily is also the rise of industrialization. Throughout the 19th century and the early 20th century, right, we have heavy industry as the novelty, not only the expansion of the railways, but also the industrialization of agriculture, mining, machinery, industry, telegraphs, the telephone, etc. And we see the rise of financial capital, which is the merging of the banking industry and manufacturing and industrialization. and finance capital is going to become the most important sector of the economy. We also see the rise of industrial monopolies, like Standard Oil Company, for example, right? And we see the rise of robber barons, our Carnegies, Rockefellers, and Vanderbilts. These are the leading industrialists of the United States. And throughout the 20th century, the American economy is going to constantly try to limit the influence of monopolies as well. So I'm going to move quickly to the next section. I don't talk so much about the United States during World War I and World War II because I cover World War II especially. I've already covered it in the section on Europe and Russia, right? So I'm going to cover it again later on. World War II it expands the world, so the United States and other countries are going to pop up there as well. But just for us, what we should know is that while the United States does grow economically in the early 20th century, right, up until 1929, though, after 1929, after the U.S. entry into World War I, the United States enters World War I because the United States had lent a lot of money to the French and the English, okay? And if they lose, then the U.S. does not get its money back. So the United States enters the war later, like 1916 or so, to help the British and the French win, because that's how the United States is going to get paid back. But by the 1930s, the United States economy goes into the Great Depression, okay? And so it is through Keynesian economics, which is basically the state getting involved in coordinating economic production and investing in hiring people and all of the infrastructure, right? Building roads, national parks. A lot of infrastructure is built through the New Deal, which is basically to put Americans to work so that people are not starving. What really gets the U.S. out of the Depression, however, is the militarization and the industrialization of the economy, militarizing, getting ready for World War II. By the late 1930s, a lot of Americans are working now in the war industries because there is a new military confrontation between the Allies, the United States, France, and the United Kingdom, versus the Axis powers, which is Japan, Nazi Germany, and fascist Italy. After World War II, the United States is going to emerge as the most important superpower. And there is a reading in the discussion assignment that references some of these big shifts in the United States becoming a world power. But after World War II, it's when the United States becomes the undisputed major world power. The United States also rebuilds Europe and Japan through the Marshall Plan, for example, and the U.S. pushes the creation of the United Nations. This is an idea that had already existed after World War I, but after World War II, the goal of the UN is to avoid World War III, okay? So far they've done pretty good. We have not gotten into World War III. The United States also becomes a major player in international monetary organizations like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And the United States is going to use these organizations to reform the economies of other countries in a way that is going to benefit the United States. And as I mentioned, as I covered last week, out of World War II, there will be two main superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. We already saw what happened in the Soviet Union, right? The Soviet Union was not able to compete with the United States. In the next section, we will pick up on the end of the Cold War.